Good evening. You're watching the main news on HKIBC. I'm Sarah Wong. Our top stories tonight. Civil servants asked to get jabbed or face the sack by February. Tik Chi-yuen remains upbeat on being the sole non-establishment voice in LegCo for the coming 4 years. And a war of words between China and Western nations on whether democracy is diminishing in Hong Kong. The government has issued an ultimatum to about 7,000 civil servants who remain unvaccinated. They could face the sack in February unless they are granted exemptions on medical grounds. The announcement came on the day Hong Kong had 8 imported infections, but none for Omicron. Johanna Chen has the details.
Hong Kong registered 8 imported cases today, all carrying mutant variants. They included 6 men and 1 boy from Britain, Austria, Germany, Pakistan, and Ghana. The other patient is a 54-year-old woman who left for the United States last Thursday. She returned home 3 days later and was tested positive at the airport. Those who had contact with her at her Tai Po home and in public venues will be asked to get tested. Meanwhile, incoming Qatar Airways flights from Doha will be halted for 2 weeks starting tomorrow, after 5 passengers had tested positive in the past week. Locally, the government is turning the screws on about 7,000 civil servants who remain unvaccinated, about 4% of the workforce. Starting next month, they must submit a negative test result every 3 days, as opposed to once a week. Those unfit for jabs because of medical conditions will continue to be reimbursed. But others who are simply reluctant have the choice of getting a shot or leaving the civil service by mid-February, when a vaccine bubble kicks in at their workplaces. All staff are required to show vaccination records when entering government offices, on top of using the Leave Home Safe app. The tightening of the restrictions came after 19 Omicron cases were imported in the past weeks. In anticipation of a further surge, arrivals from extremely high-risk countries will be discharged from Penny's Bay Quarantine Center after 4 days, 3 days earlier than the previous requirement. Infectious disease expert Ho Pak Leung revealed the science behind the decision, saying the average incubation period for Omicron patients was 2 to 3 days. While the arrangement boosts capacity at Penny's Bay by 70%, around half of the Omicron carriers will only be detected after they move to a quarantine hotel, where there is a higher risk of cross-contamination due to bad ventilation. Ho admitted this was a dilemma authorities have to face. Johanna Chan, HKIBC.
Newly elected lawmakers continue making their press rounds today. Members of the Functional and Election Committee constituencies vowed to support the government and said the era of violence and filibustering was over. Wong reports.
Fresh from their victories, Hong Kong's newly elected Legislative Council members from the Functional constituency stood together for a photo call this morning. 27 of the 30 incumbents showed up, but Insurance Sector Representative Chan Kin-por, Tony Tse from Architectural, Surveying, Planning and Landscape, and Solicitor Ambrose Lam were missing. As president of the outgoing term, Andrew Leung said everyone was looking forward to starting anew. We will abandon partisanship, aim for unity, and advise the government accordingly, he said. Martin Liao, who is considered the pro-establishment convener, vowed to support and monitor the SAR government. In his words, the violence and crazy filibustering in the past will not appear again in this 7th Legislative Council. Later in the day, members elected from and by the powerful Election Committee also came together for a press conference. Regarding the long controversial issue of enacting Article 23 of the Basic Law, former Secretary for Security Lai Tong-kwok made it clear the new panel of lawmakers would stand behind the government if it chooses to restart this conversation.
It is the Hong Kong SAR's constitutional responsibility. Nearly 25 years, we have failed to enact the law. I think it is high time for the government to introduce the bill as soon as practicable in the new LegCo session.
The new LegCo term begins on January 1st, 2022. All members will go through a swearing-in process 2 days later, after which the government will publish a list of people who took valid oaths. Wong, HKIBC.
Tik Chi-yuen, who will soon become the city's only non-establishment lawmaker, has vowed to keep fighting for universal suffrage. He added his party, Third Side, will continue to remember June 4th in its own way, but stop short on details. Wong tells us more.
Third Side's Tik Chi-yuen will have some challenging years ahead of him. The comeback lawmaker, who already served a term in the 90s within the Colonial Legislative Council, will soon begin his journey as the chamber's sole non-establishment member. He will also be navigating uncharted waters as an opposition voice elected after the sweeping national security law was implemented last June. In a wide-ranging press conference today, Tik said he considered this election a total defeat for the pro-democracy camp, despite his win. I understand many people are dissatisfied with the government, and they don't see the value in voting anymore, he said in response to the low voter turnout rate. But he added the fact that he got elected shows there is still a demand for opposition voices within the chamber. We will take on this role and put everything into it. Regarding June 4th, Tik said his party will continue to do what it has always done, which is to remember the incident, although he stopped short of explaining how that would go about. We do hope that one day the central government can directly comment on June 4th. On political reform, Tik vowed to continue fighting for democracy. To the government, I say this. If you claim to have a constitutional responsibility to enact Article 23, then you should also acknowledge your constitutional responsibility to implement universal suffrage for the chief executive and the Legislative Council, as stipulated in the Basic Law. With 90 members under the newly revamped election system, it's 1 against 89 pro-establishment lawmakers for Tik. The veteran politician said, despite their opposing views, he sees many areas in which he can collaborate with his LegCo colleagues, especially on issues related to people's livelihoods. Wong, HKIBC.
The central and SAR governments have defended Hong Kong's democracy amid mounting criticism from the West. The G7 nations and the European Union have joined a 5-nation alliance to denounce the Legislative Council polls. A war of words is intensifying between China and the West over democracy in Hong Kong. The result of Sunday's Legislative Council elections have drawn grave concerns from the group of 7 nations and the European Union. The COVID-delayed polls held under a revamped electoral system have given pro-establishment parties unmatched power in the legislature, but the turnout rate slumped to a historic low of 30.2%. The G7 called on Chinese and SAR authorities to end what they called unwarranted oppression of those advocating for democratic values. The stern statement followed a similar condemnation by the Five Eyes Alliance, which includes Australia and New Zealand. The intelligence network said the choice of LegCo candidates were severely restricted, and any meaningful opposition was quashed by the electoral overhaul. The United States took a step further, slapping sanctions on 5 deputy directors of Beijing's liaison office in the SAR under its Hong Kong Autonomy Act. Their U.S.-based access will be frozen, and American citizens and businesses barred from dealing with them. In response, the liaison office blasted a handful of Western countries for smearing Hong Kong's affairs while applauding the city's high-quality democracy. Also firing back is the Foreign Ministry's Commissioner's Office, which accused the West of manipulating Hong Kong in the name of freedom to contain China. The SAR government was quick to hop on the train of condemnation against the G7 and the EU. A SAR spokesman defended Sunday's polls as fair and representative. The government added that Hong Kong's democratic system stems from China's constitution and the basic law, instead of the Sino-British joint declaration. Beijing has imposed retaliatory sanctions on 4 American religious officials as the world's largest economies clashed over human rights in Xinjiang. They include Nadine Maenza, chairwoman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Maenza, along with the panel's vice chairman Nuri Turkle and 2 commissioners, will be barred from China, including Hong Kong. This ban came after the United States sanctioned over 30 entities and 4 mainland officials over alleged abuses against Uyghur minorities in the northwestern region. Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian accused Washington of meddling in China's internal affairs and sabotaging Sino-U.S. ties. In other news, the first 2 people charged under a new law against election tampering have been granted bail. They were 65-year-old clerk Alice Lang and 36-year-old salesman Chen Qinman. They do not know each other. The pair were charged with inciting others to cast blank ballots in the Legislative Council polls. They had allegedly shared a post from exiled former lawmaker Ted Hui, who urged people to boycott the elections. The duo were released on $1,000 bail each and will return for their next hearing in February. And coming up after the break, people around the world urged to scrap Christmas celebrations as Omicron rages on.